Hi everyone. Today I wanted to respond to a video I came across. New Olympic transgender policy isn't always simple, doctor explains. Brian Sutterer, MD, and it was released about 19 hours ago on March 26, 2026. And this video frankly pissed me off in ways that I want to unpack. The whole point of this video is just to explain why, essentially. Before we get started with this video, I just want to give a little bit of information about myself. My name's Persephone Vanderwaard. I have my MA in Gothic English Literature and an independent PhD in Gothic Poetics and Ludo-Gothic BDSM, focusing partially on Metroidvania, and I am the author of the multi-volume non-profit book series Sex Positivity versus Sex Coercion or Gothic Communism. Its art director, sole invigilator, illustrator, and primary editor, the other co-editor being Bay Ryan, a rape survivor, granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor and Dutch resistance member, and someone anti-war as a business, anti-Zionist, and anti-racist, anti-white supremacist who specializes in tokenism, e.g. TERFs, SWERFs, and fascist feminism. I am a male-to-female trans woman, Tolkien and Amazon enthusiast, anti-fascist, loud critic of Marxist-Leninism, state vampirism, atheist and Satanist, polypankingster with multiple partners, erotic artist, pornographer, and anarcho-communist. I entered my brand of Gothic gay anarcho-communism as a holistic intersectional discipline, one devised in 2022-2023, and which my friends and I currently achieve together. Originally, this blog explored my love of movies when I was cishet. Now I use it to write about the Gothic, horror, but also sex, heavy metal, and video games in a queer way. I take donations for my work, which goes towards helping sex workers, trans people, and other minorities impacted by fascism. I currently take payment on PayPal, Patreon, and Cash App, etc. All links are available on my link tree. Every bit helps. Also, a quick disclaimer before I start. And this is the disclaimer for a different essay, but I use the same disclaimer for all of my essays, video responses, what have you. Disclaimer regarding essay contents, or in this case, video contents. All opinions are my own. I use part of my research conducted alongside my book series, Gothic Communism. The material within is written, speaks about public figures in popular media for purposes of sex education, satire, transformation, and critique, hence falls under fair use regarding copyright and free speech regarding defamation/obscenity laws. The Miller Test. Click here for my entire series disclaimer. Before we start watching this video, this is me from the future after having recorded everything, and I hate to say that I get a little bit upset. I get a little bit mad at Dr. Brian Sutterer. And this reminds me of something that John the Duncan said in their video, Rage Bait. How should we talk to people in the manosphere, or talk about the manosphere? And in it, they basically say, if someone says something that's triggering, you should get angry at them. You don't want to normalize these kinds of behaviors. You want to speak out against people like this, regardless if they're openly reactionary, if they're crypto-fascists, or if they're just benefactors of genocide in any shape or form. It doesn't matter. You shouldn't be afraid to critique fancy-pants doctors like Brian Sutterer, who's saying a lot of really transphobic, transmedicalist bullshit, conducive to trans genocide and just genocide more broadly, because genocides overlap. They imbricate. They don't just stay separate. That's how capital works. It exploits smaller groups at the same time, seemingly separate, but actually simultaneously. So what's happening with trans people is going to affect women, and he can't take 1 second to realize, oh, hey, it's affecting cis women. What about trans people? And even if we were just completely delusional and just out of our minds, should we still be subject to these invasive genocidal procedures? Should we be locked up by the state? You know, he doesn't have anything to say about that. We're just not deserving of empathy, according to him. So when I heard that, I got triggered. I got angry. And the point being is that this video is one where abusers tell you it's just a joke when you overreact to their abuse. There are times when survivors/targets of abuse need to listen to that little voice ringing alarm bells in the back of their mind. It keeps us alive by exposing the abuser not just as fraud, but harmful agent preying on us and others behind optional masks of show and hide. This is specifically in regards to reactionaries, but it also applies to the good doctor here, who isn't so good. He is a jerk. And I would like to add, as someone who's investigated fascism for a long time, and people that I might just call a Nazi willy-nilly is actually a part of my opinion as an anti-fascist through my research. Opinion, by its very nature, is not defamatory. However, my opinion does get quite spicy, and I think that this person, among other things, is a two-faced douchebag who can't see the forest for the trees. And as you watch this video, I will be calling them lots of names. All of those names are my opinion, which again is not defamatory. It is not libel to critique someone by calling them a douchebag tied to your arguments. It's, hey, this person's a jerk, this person's an asshole, this person's a fascist. Fascism is literally protected speech in the United States. As long as you're not actively causing harm to other people in a very obvious way through direct evidence, guess what? You can be a fascist in the United States. The same is true of free speech, where I can critique someone who I think is fascist. R.E., fascism is something that white moderates like this dickhead doesn't challenge. And I'm going to be very candid about that in a variety of ways. So when you're watching this video, just bear in mind, the spicy bitch in me is going to come out. Claws coming out, motherfuckers. And I'm not going to hold back against this guy because he fucking sucks. In my completely professional opinion, of course. To do so, I'll have to give a certain amount of context. I'll explain my initial response after providing it, and we'll go over some different resources as to why I think this person is transphobic in a transmedicalist way. So these are terms that, having introduced them here, I'll have to unpack them through the context of the Olympics being a fascist event and doctors often being transphobic. Not always, but in defense of profit, in defense of sports, in defense of larger heteronormative, settler colonial, Cartesian institutions like the United States and giant money vacuums like the Institute of Sports, fascism, Western liberalism, and the values that those represent in defense of or obfuscating the exploitation that capital normally enacts on a day-to-day basis. That's sort of the larger macro scale issue at work, but it's something that is unfolding through Dr. Brian, who is here to tell us that the new Olympic transgender policy isn't always simple. And I thought, this is something I should respond to. And in watching it, I saw him basically saying things that, to me, felt transmedicalist, which is to say transphobic through a medical lens, in ways that uphold previous statements I've made about doctors being reactionary to moderate in defense of capitalism, including through sports as an industry to not only gatekeep, but to uphold the values thereof in ways that ignore different genocides going on. All right, so the video by Dr. Brian is Transgender Women Athletes Banned from Female Olympic Events by New IOC Policy. And in the description of their video, they give a link to said article by stillmedolympics.com. The International Olympic Committee announced a new policy for testing genetic sex. So this is, at its core, eugenics, right? It is basically gatekeeping people based on whether or not they adhere to a gender binary that is grounded in biological essentialism. So that's fascist right off the bat. Just the procedure unto itself. But what about the Olympics? The Olympics themselves are rooted in fascist propaganda. They were something that, alongside the rise of an increase of a heteronormative institute of sports, led to an imaginary antiquity, a making great of the past in ways that you could pursue for present-day glory. But that present-day glory was rooted in various forms of nostalgia that are unto themselves hauntological, specifically fascist. So here's a little bit of history about that from some more news. The Olympics are kind of bad, actually, and they have a small section here, history, that sort of lays it out.
The Olympics are terrible for everyone, except Michael Jordan and the '92 Dream Team. The Olympics were pretty great for those guys, but for everyone else, the Olympics are butts, and they've been butts since the start of the modern era. The first modern Olympics were the 1896 Summer Games, which were held in Athens and brought together 241 athletes from 14 nations. That's shortly after they formed the International Olympics Committee, aka the IOC, aka the governing body of the Olympics. No word if that one was corrupt. It was 1896 though, so that probably sucked in general. But the iconic Olympic torch relay, which opens the games with a relay of torchbearers running from Athens to the host city to light the Olympic flame, only started in 1936, specifically for the Nazi-hosted Berlin Games. So one of the most lasting images of the Olympics was created as a group project with the Third Reich while the games were all hugged up with the Nazis. That's cool. We should keep putting that on stamps, I guess.
So, yeah, a lasting symbol of the Olympics, the lighting of the torch and carrying it through a torchbearer, is literally Nazi propaganda and tied to Western liberalism and various nations, sovereign nations that recognize the sovereignty of each other under capital, competing through their athletes. It's not the ancient glory of the gods through city-states from antiquity. It's specifically nation-states under capital through Nazi propaganda that has survived into the present day. It's literally a dog whistle that is being used to promote an institution that was made famous by the Nazis. And the Nazis, if you know anything about history, actually borrowed much of their approach to the world, not just from the ancient past, and not just from non-Western cultures. The crooked cross, for instance, was borrowed from non-Western cultures, or the word Aryan was borrowed from non-Western cultures. They also borrowed liberally from the United States and its own tools of Western liberalism to obfuscate genocide in the language of liberty, but also, as we'll see, through the language of doctors. So, keeping in mind that the Olympics, and for all intents and purposes, the entire institution of sports as a giant organization of different aspects of the sporting world, are used to promote first and foremost Western values under capital that obfuscate the very exploitation that capital does by design. And they will gatekeep various people from these institutions as part of a larger ongoing genocide against a variety of people, including trans folk. Which brings us to Brian's video. Brian's video is talking about the Olympics and how trans women athletes are being banned from the female Olympic events by a new IOC policy, as we mentioned, keeping in mind that the Olympics is historically a fascist event or a fasc-coded event that, through fascism and Western liberalism, two sides of the same coin under capital, find all different ways of not only gatekeeping people from attending these events, but the reasons for why they're gatekeeping them are not only transmedicalist, but deeply sexist, too. There's a variety of bigotries, in fact. The Olympics are racist. The Olympics are exclusionary according to race, according to class, according to culture. There's a variety of reasons that they exclude for the special privilege to compete and uphold, for all intents and purposes, the status quo. And people who are omitted from this event often being transgender women. We'll get into that, but that's the premise. Okay, so this sporting world where you have a hierarchy of values where you have the creme de la creme who are invited to attend the Olympic Games, to go to Olympus for all intents and purposes, an imaginary made-up place that has been revived hauntologically in the present space and time under capitalism, under capitalist realism. The same hierarchy of values that's heteronormative, Cartesian, and settler colonial under America and Western liberalism, Pax Americana, and capitalism more broadly is being used to gatekeep transgender athletes, specifically transgender women. You don't hear the same controversies in regards to transgender men, for instance. You do see it with intersex people, of course, often intersex people of color. The point being is that I'm not strictly talking about just the gatekeeping unto itself, but the fact that it's tied to a fascist institution, which is to say, it is often presented in a Western liberal kind of way. This is America, but it's tied to fascism through these values, Western liberal values that are moderate, tied to fascist reactionary ones, which is essentially what this is. It's a reactionary policy that is targeting transgender women under the false pretense, supposition that they're protecting women from transgender women. So real women are being protected from transgender women through a form of biological essentialism. This is, think of the women and children. This policy will not just stop at transgender women. Transgender women are the scapegoat to a larger issue that will affect all kinds of different people. And to be fair, as much as I can be, to Brian Sutterer, they are describing these policies as potentially having long-reaching effects, and the policy itself isn't even necessarily considerate of the larger biological factors at play. So if that were all that they were saying, that would be fine. But within this larger argument that they're making, they go out of their way to say transmedicalist things about trans people, essentially making them a moderate form of Western thought through the institution of sports. They're being transphobic themselves by saying, well, there are some people, some trans people, who are disabled. They have a disorder. There's something wrong with them. We can diagnose them, and they don't necessarily have an advantage. But then there are some transgender women who just decide to be trans people, and they are just sneaking into these events for all intents and purposes. I'm paraphrasing, but we'll get to that. And they're competing with an unfair advantage. So he's still being transphobic. He's just being moderate about it. Trust me, guys, I'm a doctor. I'm dressed up all night, dapper, and all nice, dapper, and neat, and I'm going to explain things in a calm, rational way. He's the man of reason, but he is hiding within his reasoned Enlightenment-style argument. Oh, actually, some trans women are false. Some of them are not, and we should feel sorry for those ones. There are problems with both sides of that argument. We'll get to all of that, but that's sort of the gist. That's what I encountered going into this video, and it's what pissed me off. Point in fact, it pissed me off enough to write the following. I left a comment, which, if you go to the video on your own account, you will probably not see this comment. It has been, for all intents and purposes, deleted, but it is up here. Transgender woman here. Banning us from sports is part of transgenocide tied to fascism. You are contributing to that by treating trans women like men, i.e. like a transmed, saying we're true males, or faking it, ignoring the effects of years of HRT required to compete on the human body in these institutions. That's wrong, and so often doctors are cops in scrubs, or whatever you're wearing. First, do no harm, Doc. I implore you to remember the oath you swore instead of betraying it. Also, ICE is kidnapping trans folk and experimenting on us in prisons, i.e. conversion therapy. Got an opinion on that, Hippocrates? So yeah, I was not happy when I watched this video initially, And my pissed off response was basically made through the context that I just gave. But I feel as though I should probably unpack that a little bit more. And then we'll watch the video itself and respond to it. So again, my response initially was upset. I say, I fucking hate transmeds, treating trans women like infiltrators like this guy does, e.g. saying we're true males or faking it, ignoring the effects of years of HRT required to compete on the human body, etc. I don't even like sports, but banning us from it is bullshit. And furthermore, I didn't have room to include it here, fascist. So keeping that in mind, I have written about transmeds before, and I am used to encountering it in ways that might not leap out at first glance. Because again, when you see Brian Sutterer, oh, trust me, bros, I'm a doctor, there's no way that doctors could be bigoted, right? Even though historically doctors have been sexist towards women more broadly for the majority of their existence as an institution. Women in the 1800s, for instance, were treated as hysterical, susceptible to something called wandering womb, and dressed up in more modern language, hysteria being one of those terms, where doctors would basically force women to have orgasms, administering those orgasms themselves, of course, as a medicine to treat women for being hysterical, stemming more recently in world history from Enlightenment thought, which had a tendency to treat beings of nature as separate from thinking beings, and furthermore as mechanical objects that the owners of nature, white cishet European Protestant men, first and foremost, as the owners of a priori, and doctors in the 1800s would be sexist towards women, so much so that in the late 1900s into the 1950s, there would be the development of various procedures to tame women's hysterical nature by lobotomizing them or sterilizing them and various other things. The lobotomy procedure was actually invented by a war criminal who, incidentally, was given the Nobel Prize, itself invented to whitewash the inventor of dynamite, to have something that he could use to basically cover up the fact that he had invented something that was responsible for killing large numbers of people tied to the profit motive. So we should absolutely critique white moderates and science and the medical profession, because it is something that is harmful towards trans people. First and foremost, doctors are cops. So you might not be accustomed to thinking of doctors as cops. So in this specific magazine, A.T.A.C.K, Angry Trannies Against Cops and Kings and Dykes, Faggots, etc. I'm queer, I can say these things. Specifically issue 9, February 24, Pain. You cannot buy the revolution, you cannot make the revolution, you can only be the revolution. It is in your spirit, or it is nowhere. There is a specific section that talks about doctors being cops. You're not allowed to do it yourself, so just sit tight there on the shelf. Let us wring our hands and say, it's the safest to wait another day. Trust your doctors, trust the system, and never question our true mission. We'll help you soon. We promise we care. Here's 2 milligrams Spiro, a hope and a prayer. There are different pages here, but I want to scroll down to all doctors are bad. ADAB, or all doctors are bad. You have to play the game with doctors. Doctors are secret cops, you see. They say they're not. They're on your side and here to help you. But God's forbid you step out of line. How dare you know yourself? Forget all about the hours of research you spent on symptoms, the weeks and months in community with others in similar positions. Nah, you're making those symptoms up. Drug seeking, It's fine to take the drugs if they push them, but you can never ask. It doesn't matter how many reasons you have to believe the meds will help. It doesn't matter if you've been prescribed before. Now you're drug seeking, and that's going in your record, you sick junkie. Frankly, it doesn't matter if you ask or not. If you come in with a background or history deemed suspicious, you're homeless or work 2 jobs or queer or trans or not, white or are fat or mentally ill, or heaven forbid you have a drug use history of any kind. Now, what next if you have your life-ruining symptoms and you're labeled an addict already, so nothing is getting treated? That's when some people might understandably self-medicate with whatever they can, and that's where the public cops come in. 'Cause see, you're an addict, just like the doctors always fucking said. And now you're so desperate for symptom relief with no hope of medical intervention, and fuck it, the chart already says drug addict. So you're on treated chronic pain or your anxiety for which you will never again see real medical intervention, or your unmanaged ADHD with a higher pattern of community suicidality than depression alone. Turns out you can medicate this non-exhaustive list yourself if you try hard enough. But that's where drug cops come in, and your medical history says you've gone further into addiction. No one will ever believe you if you recover. And what is recovery if you aren't on drugs, but are debilitated by panic and pain and no longer have the will to live? So this is a basic premise of all doctors are bad, because doctors, under capital in particular, serve profit. And this brings us to writing that I've done as well. Specifically, White Moderates Don't Challenge Fascism. This short follow-up essay, specifically to a past critique of Solomon Nelson I wrote called White Moderates Don't Challenge Fascism, covers the controversies currently unfolding between him and Mike Israetel. And you might ask, well, what does this have to do with Dr. Brian Sutterer? Well, the point being is that white moderates still don't challenge fascism. White moderates don't challenge fascism is a thesis argument that I wrote in regards to Solomon Nelson and Mike Israetel, a white moderate and a fascist preaching race science. Suddenly it starts to sound a little bit more relevant, a little bit more germane, because this individual is essentially a white moderate who, as we'll see, is making transmedicalist arguments about trans women and saying, well, some of them are just sick and the law shouldn't apply to them, or you have trans people who are true males, which is to say biological males, right? That is a TERF argument tied to biological essentialism and fascism, wouldn't you know it, under a umbrella of the sports world that has unto itself a fascist history tied to capital and Western liberalism. And Western liberalism, fascism, reactionary, moderate, this doctor, a cop, is someone who's dressing it up in a particular moderate way, not unlike Solomon Nelson versus Mike Israetel, where there is a reactionary argument that is being made that is unto itself exclusionary and tied to genocide. And then you have a more reasoned argument that dresses it up in different ways that have the same result. And that is what Dr. Sutterer is doing here. So I, in my response to Dr. Sutterer, say, I hate transmed because they're treating us like infiltrators, and specifically that we're true males, or that we're faking it, or that Sutterer is ignoring the effects of years of HRT required to commit on the human body, which is a matter of policy, by the way, while also at the same time ignoring the fact that ICE is kidnapping trans folk and experimenting on us in prisons, i.e. conversion therapy. This gatekeeping is something that is happening in the middle of a genocide. A genocide where this person is saying, actually, it's complicated. And they're not really getting to the point in a way that exposes the fascist rot within a Western liberal institution like the Olympics. So I have a few other things that I want to provide as well before we get into the critique itself. One of them is that I write about transmedicalist myself, and this isn't just something that comes from actual doctors. It often comes from celebrities or trans people, gender nonconforming people who are themselves reactionary or writing or acting out through grievance in ways that exclude various peoples. For example, I write about Natalie Wynn, a cis trans woman who is exclusionary towards MBs or non-binary people. I write about Natalie Wynn, who is also a liberal Zionist, I might add, and I write about someone like Hunter Schafer being transmedicalist. Transmedicalist arguing that you have to basically have a lived medical experience that when it is enacted in a legitimized way through the medical system, suddenly you're trans, as opposed to self-medicating or not even transitioning legally, but in a way where you're just like, okay, I'm trans, I think, therefore I am, not to use Descartes in an unironic way. He's responsible for the Cartesian revolution and Cartesian dualism, but at the end of the day, being trans is a social concept, so the term basically applies. If I feel like I'm trans, I am. That's how gender works. It's not rooted in biology, as Judith Butler would also argue. So transmedicalism is something that applies to a wide variety of social issues. But specifically in the world of sports, there are other people who have explored it as well when basically pushing back against Enlightenment systems and practitioners of thought. So Essence of Thought, someone that I respect a great deal and who, being trans themselves, is punching up at people who punch down in ways that are dressed up through the language of reason, specifically rationality rules, tied to the world of sports. Rationality rules screws up on the science of trans athletes again. And this is part 2 of a larger series, so if you click on this video, you can go and see more. Should we do away with gender in sports? A trans perspective. Refuting the anti-trans pseudoscience on trans athletes, RE rationality rules. I would imagine that a lot of what is said here also applies to Dr. Sutterer. And early transphobia and sexism in sports. This is a history that talks about similar issues tied to fascism in the Olympics, fascism in sports more broadly. Capital is a system that is built on certain values that gentrify and decay towards fascism, which is capital defending itself in crisis, in decay. Capital is dying, fascism emerges and falls back on various values that rescind the rights of certain athletes, gatekeeping them in ways that uphold the status quo. It is a return to tradition away from modernity. And this is something that has existed in modern sports out of antiquity. So I've written about transmedicalism. Essence of Thought has written about it vis-a-vis men of reason who seem moderate but punch down in defense of athletes in the sports world. They're gatekeepers, gaslight, gatekeep, girl boss. And keeping all of that in mind, it ties to white moderates and reactionaries in the world of science, in the world of sports. And they have tremendous blind spots when it comes to fascism and its presence within these arguments, within the world at large. And in doing so, they are essentially cops. They are men of reason. Many of them medical doctors are cops in a literal official sense. They are gatekeepers in ways where they provide their own trust me bro arguments. All that's missing from this guy is a beard, and then he'd be a white guy with a beard and people would take him seriously. In his case, he has a tie and he's a medical doctor, but it's the same basic idea. It's, I am a man of reason, I swore an oath to do no harm, so you gotta trust me, right? There's no way that I could be wrong, but he is serving the same basic function as men like Solomon Nelson, Mike Israetel, as rationality rules, and the Olympics more broadly. he is a whitewasher, and he's doing that in the middle of a trans genocide. So the last thing that we'll do here before we get to my response of the good doctor is there was a particular thing that he said, specifically, it isn't always simple. And this made me think of a particular statement made by Michael Brooks when he took a question on Israel and Palestine. So if you want to watch the entire video, you can, but it's summarized here in a way that we are going to apply to Dr. Sutterer. So it's not a complex issue. That's the big thing. It's super simple. There's one group that has enormous power. It's the most powerful country in the Middle East. It's backed by the United States. It acts on another population of people with total impunity and is never held accountable for anything. So there's no symmetry in the relationship, period. Michael Brooks at Lafayette College on Thursday, February 27th, 2020. And what Michael is talking about is genocide against the Palestinians by the Israelis being funded by the Americans. But the same basic idea, and the one that I'm referring to when I am critiquing or commenting on Dr. Sutterer, transgender woman here, banning us from sports as part of trans genocide tied to fascism, I'm referring to the same thing. It's not complex. It is actually quite simple. And anyone who says that it's complex or otherwise overlooks the issue, simple or complex, is complacent in genocide, making them fascist, in this case for Dr. Sutterer, between or behind a moderate veneer. So not only do they not challenge fascism, but they are effectively whitewashing it. They're complicit in the arrangement. And if you want more examples about what I was referring to when I said that there is a genocide going on with trans people, it partially just includes what Dr. Sutterer is doing by accusing some trans people of being true males or faking it or ignoring the effects of HRT tied to the Olympics, a Nazi event, which we've already gone over, but specifically this event. So sign in required. So if you sign in and you click on this link, it is for this article. This person says, in regards to the Trump administration admits to medically experimenting on trans people in prisons, which is what I was referring to when I was critiquing Dr. Sutterer. This person, in regards to the same situation, says, this needs to be stopped. This is a violation of both HHS medical ethics and the Nuremberg Code on medical experimentation. This is genocide, and every citizen of every signatory nation of the UN Genocide Convention is morally and legally obligated to take action to stop this. Which is what I meant when I said, hey, do you have an opinion on that, Hippocrates? What about that oath that you swore to uphold? First, do no harm. Ignoring genocide by making its complicated arguments in the face of said genocide, which this policy fundamentally is genocidal on your part. This is what I mean when I say this person is complicit. And if you want to know more specifically about what's happening to trans people, not just arguing about eugenics, but the aim of preserving trans men and their fertility. So this doesn't just affect trans women in sports who are being tortured in prisons alongside trans men, but trans men as being tortured as well. The Trump administration admits to testing conversion therapy on trans prisoners and implies its policy of forcibly detransitioning trans men in prisons has the aim of preserving their fertility. Same exact idea applies to any gender nonconforming person, because again, capital is heteronormative at the end of the day. It treats trans people as the enemy because their existence is antithetical to capital. It's not something that capital can take into itself perpetually outside of a us versus them context, because capital exploits by design, and it exploits nature through a heteronormative settler colonial Cartesian lens, that treats trans people as whores to pimp, as infiltrators, as homewreckers, what have you. So if you want to read more about that, this article talks about it at length. Last month, the Trans Administration released its new policy concerning the treatment of trans people in federal prisons. As Transmedicalism reported at the time, this policy is nothing short of egregious. Under it, the approximately 2,200 trans people in federal custody will be medically and socially detransitioned against their will, all in the name of helping them recover from gender dysphoria. So this is gay panic under fascism. When coupled in the controlled environment that is prison, this forced conversion therapy policy amounts to little more than medical experimentation, and it's in explicit violation of most of the Nuremberg Code, which was created in the aftermath of World War II. Simply put, if the court's allowed to take effect, this policy will undoubtedly lead to tremendous suffering. So yeah, fascist. And this is all of the context that I have to take to basically explain, look, a genocide is going on and it's affecting people like myself, trans men, trans women, non-binary people, and other people who are taken against their will without due process and forced into a prison-like environment where they are violated in a variety of ways, including their gender, their social rights, their basic human rights more broadly. Capital does this by design. As the state decays, it rules through fear by scapegoating various people through the usual mechanisms of capital, I might add. It's the imperial boomerang, and it affects certain people on the outside or closer to the out group than the in group. And this individual, a person who is closer to the in group, a white straight guy, for all intents and purposes, he might be gay. I'm not going to speculate on that, but for all intents and purposes, a straight, for all intents and purposes, cishet guy is talking about trans people in ways that are transmedicalist, ignoring genocide. So that's all the context for that. It takes a long time to basically undo the damage that he's doing. And by the time I explain all of this, most people will have tuned out of this video if they even see it at all. Whereas someone like this with a giant channel, 866,000 subscribers with about 10,000 views, so not the largest views of a channel of his size by any extent, but then you have people who are watching it who are saying, I learned so much from one video more than hours I've heard from all the years worth of hot takes in every podcast on the planet. This is the take that was missing. We're living in toxic times and need more voices like Brian. So these people think that he's like some arbiter of truth. This is how whitewashing works. But rooted within that argument is that still some trans people are false. And that's the argument that he makes, and which we'll get to next. All of that being said, what we're going to do now is we're going to go through the entire video. It's relatively short, and I'll try not to pause too often, but we'll stop every so often to respond to what the good doctor here is saying.
The International Olympic Committee just announced a new policy to implement genetic testing to try and better address the issue of transgender athletes in sports.
This is effectively the trans question tied to eugenics.
And we're going to dive into this, and I'm going to give you my honest thoughts and try and improve the conversation.
So, key word here, his honest thoughts. So this isn't him being duplicitous. This is, for all intents and purposes, unless stated otherwise by him after the fact, his honest opinion. He's giving it to us straight. So this is how he actually feels.
Conversation. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Dr. Brian Sutterer, and the goal in this channel is to teach you more about the medical side of the sports world. And this is not the first time I've addressed this topic.
So he is a medical doctor in the sports field, and he has talked about this previously. This person, if memory serves, wasn't even intersex. They were just a cis woman.
The last Summer Games, I talked about the Imam Khalif situation and gave my opinion on it, and now I want to talk about...
I'm not familiar about what they said at the time, so we'll just be sticking to this video in particular.
My thoughts with this whole new policy. I don't think the sports world and every sports league is...
So they don't immediately condemn the policy, first and foremost. That's a huge red flag. They should just condemn it automatically because it's eugenicist bullshit tied to fascism.
Is ready for the impact that this genetic testing may have. Now, don't get me wrong.
So they're talking about the impact of it as affecting not just trans people, but athletes more broadly, I would assume. But then they go on to say this.
I'm 100% against the idea of athletes who have had male hormonal development benefiting their athletic performance competing against traditional female athletes.
Traditional female athletes, aka biological men and women. So they adhere to the gender binary, even if they go on to say, oh, well, it's not as simple as men and women. They're basically upholding the gender binary anyways. And this is a transmedicalist argument. And this, for all intents and purposes, however moderate they might sound, makes them essentially fascist with a moderate veneer. Because if you're not attacking and denormalizing fascism fiercely in the middle of a genocide, I might add, then you are a part of the problem. You are not just complacent, but complicit. He is failing as a doctor.
I think that is completely wrong, and I think we should do what we can to try.
So apparently, he's spreading this myth that there are infiltrators who enjoy these unspoken benefits through puberty, and those are completely irreversible, and HRT isn't something that can impact an athlete's ability to perform, even though there are plenty of examples where athletes who have transitioned don't just clean up the competition. So he's spreading a myth about trans women athletes who apparently are just a threat to real women everywhere. So this is transphobic on its face, and it's delivered in a transmedicalist way, dressed up in moderate language that is ignoring transgenocide by not attacking this policy.
Trying in the best way possible while looking out for the well-being of these affected individuals.
The well-being. So, oh, don't worry, I'm doing this as a doctor. I'm trying to prevent harm. Well, buddy, you're doing a pretty piss poor job.
Make those changes so that we remove that aspect of sports.
So they're arguing for reform, not revolution. They want to keep the policy, but just use it to target real men and who are dressing up as women, essentially. So, yeah, transphobic.
I'm here to tell you that this topic of sex and gender being such a black and white thing that everybody on social media wants to pretend is just not true.
It's not black and white. In fact, they're actually separate. They overlap, of course, because social and biological variables do, but they are intrinsically separate from each other. They're modular. A person's sex is determined by a variety of biological factors. A person's gender is determined by a variety of social components that are enforced through a heteronormative society under capital into a gender binary, which you're ultimately upholding by punching down at certain trans people. And then infantilizing and victimizing the other ones, treating them like patients who are sick. Like, you're viewing this entirely through being trans as some kind of like disease or disorder.
This idea that there can only be two sexes, male, female, and
that's a myth.
There is no room in the middle for these genetic variations and developmental variations is just
variation is a nice neutral term. It's a spectrum.
Completely uneducated falsities. We're going to get to this chart in a little bit, but this is what.
In your case, I would say that you're educated in a way where you're educated in ways where you're basically furthering propaganda. So despite the education that you do have, there are obviously limits to your education because you're furthering genocide, in my opinion.
What your biology class in middle school did not teach you. There's these things called disorders of sexual differentiation.
Disorders of sexual differentiation. So again, he's viewing this as a disorder, as a disease, a condition. I know that like disorder, syndrome, and disease are technically different things. I'm using them interchangeably, whatever. The point being is that he views it as like a problem, as something to basically treat like a doctor would.
That relate to your karyotype, which is your genetic makeup, your X, your Y chromosomes, and then also how that affects your external genitalia, how you're raised, your body.
So genotype versus phenotype.
Body's internal hormones. And so this is like the meat of what I want people to better understand when it comes to these issues about gender. The concept of the new policy is that they're going to do testing for something called SRY. SRY is part of your Y chromosome that essentially turns on the male development pathway. So
it's also important to acknowledge that at conception, everyone is female. And then there's a specific thing that occurs shortly thereafter that turns some people male. But at conception, everyone is female. Important thing to recognize. Also, just a side note, but trans people, because of that, are oftentimes the way that transition occurs leads to people, their biology within their bodies, their brains in particular, not changing with the rest of their bodies. So you can have being born in the wrong body is because you can have a brain that doesn't change and it stays a female brain. And you could say, oh, well, men and women, are their brains really that different from each other? Well, feelings of dysphoria start in the brain, right? And from the moment of conception, where you have the supposed moment of change that affects the body homogeneously, that's just not the case. And gender dysphoria stems from that fact. But this test doesn't care about that. It just assumes that the change is total and complete, and that's just not the case.
So yes, that makes sense. The test is a legitimate thing that if you have...
It's legitimate through the state as something to enforce through cops, such as yourself. A de facto cop. In your case, you're not a cop with a badge, but you do have a badge, right? You're like, trust me, I'm a doctor. It's okay, I'm a limo driver. It's a legitimate way to enforce genocide against some trans people, men in dresses. And even though you don't say the quiet part out loud, the true belief that you say is in your argument, that you believe that certain trans people are acting with an inherent advantage over others, and it's about fairness. And I got news for you, buddy. Sports was never about fairness. It was about competition. It's not about fair. Plenty of people, if it were about fairness and all things being created equal, then the world of sports will look very different than how it looks now.
This SRY presence in your genetic material, that means you have theoretically had the Y chromosome that's going to turn on your male gender sexual development. If we back all this up to basic embryology and biology here, up until about 6 weeks of development, the gonads, the sexual organs in the body, are the same. In fact, the default pathway that will go down is to become female. The SRY sequence of the Y chromosome, it's present on the Y chromosome. When it is there, it initiates the male development pathway to form the testes. If SRY is not present, then you'd proceed down the default pathway, which is developing female. So yes, this idea of they are going to require testing for SRY as a marker of sex, basic biology, makes complete sense. As you continue down development, the testes, cells in the testes, will secrete something called anti-Müllerian hormone, AMH. When that is present, it causes regression of the internal female gonads, like the uterus, the fallopian tubes, and then you continue to proceed down the male pathway. You get this hormone called DHT that is present because of 5-alpha reductase. We'll get to 5-alpha reductase in a little bit. That DHT leads to male external genitalia. You then get testosterone during puberty, and down that traditional male pathway, that testosterone is what leads to development of those secondary male characteristics, which we know have a true athletic advantage in sport. So default pathway, yes, makes sense.
Yeah, but it's also not something that's distributed evenly. There's going to be variation between men and women, even in a cisgender way. Some men are going to have less testosterone than some women, and they might not even, not to the degree that they would be considered intersex. There's going to be variation. There's going to be genetic variation between athletes within a gender binary. It's not something that you can control for the way that they're trying to do through the state. There's just no way to police that. And so instead what they're doing is they're going based on appearance, or they're going based on ideological factors. Oh, well, trans people, it's a witch hunt. It's scapegoating trans people. And they're dressing it up as a legitimate procedure, the same way that they might do during the Holocaust or in a gulag. and experimenting on people. This is just opening the door to let the state invade and experiment on people. It's only legitimate because the state has a monopoly on violence under Weber through the territories that it tries to control, including people's bodies in the world of sports.
SRY present on the Y chromosome turns on the male pathway. Without that present, you default down the default female pathway.
Okay, sure.
Sounds very simple, right? And yes, for most people, the vast majority of people in the world, the vast majority of athletes, it is that simple.
Yeah, and even with trans people, we're a minority for a reason. Within the United States, the last time I checked, though it's been a few years now, the number of trans people who reported as being trans in the United States was less than 1% of the population, about 1.5 million, if memory serves. So it was like 0.04% or something like that. It was not a lot. And the number of trans people that exist is something that puts us in a situation where we are an extreme minority, but then it's modular, right? Because you can have trans people who are an ethnic minority. You can have trans people of color. You can have trans women, trans men of color, indigenous people, two-spirit people. It can be religious minorities. So there's a lot of different things that can happen. But when you're targeting trans people through procedures like this, which are inherently genocidal, eugenicist, it's framed as, oh, it's legitimate. There's the science behind it is sound. And I'm like, I don't care how sound the science is. It's whether or not we give power to the state. States' rights versus workers' rights. And you're basically apologizing for the state right now. Let's continue.
It is truly a black and white, male-female issue. But we have these very real things called...
This is where the transmedicalism comes in, because he's like, well, it's black or white unless we account for these medical conditions. So it's bioessentialist as opposed to a social issue. So he's viewing this through the lens of a doctor without discount. He's discounting entirely the social aspect of gender, which is to say all of gender.
Disorders of sexual differentiation, because there is a very complicated pathway to go from a simple XY chromosome, SRY, turning on the male pathway because of all the hormones involved, all the receptors that are involved, changes that you can have in how many X chromosomes. There are so many variations.
I hate this. He's like, here, look at this chart of all these different diseases. Let me show you. It's a freak show. And it's something where he can just rattle off all of these things and show off how smart he is. This is just, it's not gibberish. These are legitimate medical terms, but it's also completely ignoring the reality that trans people are people, period. They're not defined by doctors. And he's defining them entirely as a disease. It's like, oh, well, there's men and women, and then there's sick people. Oh, okay. That's not fascist at all.
That can happen. While albeit rare, these are the examples. The common ones you might hear of are complete androgen insensitivity, where, just like it says, you produce androgens, you're completely insensitive to the androgens, so you don't see the external effects. These are individuals who are XY, right? So on paper, their karyotype, you would say they are male, but they're typically raised as a female. They don't have the androgens ability to affect the tissue to develop into a male. So you typically look female, but your genetics would say that you're male. How do you define that individual? Do you define them based on what they externally look like as a female, or do you define them on the internal?
What about the social issues? Again, it's not just phenotype. It's not just genotype. Defining people according to their biology is eugenicist. And defining people how they appear is phrenologist. These are fascist ideas. This ties to race science. This ties to patriarchal thinking. This ties to Cartesian dualism. I think, therefore I am, as a model of domination where you map out everything. This is just a map of how to control people's bodies.
Genetics. In this case, there tends to be no real sports benefit because, again, you don't have...
Again, it's not a question of benefit in sports, or fairness. If that were the case, then what about all the traditional, cishet men who cheat at sports, who have a variety of advantages through various legislation that And funding, I don't hear you talking about that, doctor. And there's a lot of different things that affect fairness in sports aside from people's biology. But isn't it funny how the one thing that you're supposedly pushing back against is just another means of policing people's biology, which, again, RE, wandering womb, right? It's a control of women's bodies or gender nonconforming people more broadly or racial minorities, what have you. Anyone can be policed this way and being seen as having an unfair advantage because of their biology. It's a double standard, and one that historically applies to anyone other than the status quo, anyone other than white straight men, such as yourself.
Sensitivity to the androgens to get the subsequent muscle development, and rightfully so in the Olympic policy, which you can go read. It's all posted.
The fascist policy on the protection of the female category in Olympic sport. And so again, it's think of the women. This is something to govern and police by an administration held under categorical review through policies that are capitalist in nature, are fascist in nature.
Online, they do tease out these DSD, these XY syndromes that don't have a competitive advantage and remove them from being excluded. And so they're being thoughtful in that.
Oh, how generous. Oh, well, if you have what we consider to be a disorder or disease, then we won't exclude you, but we'll exclude people that we think have a disease of the mind, who are just have that trans social virus. It's again, you're treating certain people as beings to exclude. It's Foucault's panopticon, historically a tower that would overlook people and exclude them on the basis of whether or not they were diseased, whether they were sick. It's discipline and punish.
That regard that, okay, just because you have SRY doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have a competitive advantage. And so therefore, if you're raised female, since there's no competitive advantage, you're okay to continue competing against other females. So they're kind of contradicting them.
Yeah, okay, well, sure, they're contradicting themselves. They're full of it. So that means you're against the policy, right?
It's not as simple as, do you have male genetics as most.
So again, he's going to fall back on, oh, well, allow me to, put in the work to legitimize what you're doing. I'll give you the correct procedure so that you can continue doing eugenics and phrenology.
People on social media would identify them as. It's a step further of, is there a competitive advantage, which I think is good. The more common one you'll see in the sports world, though, in reference to talk about, is this 5-alpha reductase deficiency, where you don't have proper function of an enzyme that converts these hormones. And so you tend to have kind of female ambiguous genitalia at birth. Oftentimes you're assigned female at birth, especially in some like lower developed countries.
And this is intermisia, is basically phobic towards intersex people. The idea of assigning someone's gender at birth. Intersex people are generally given corrective surgery without their consent, not just circumcision, but various other invasive surgeries. Again, done by doctors according to a gender binary, which is fascist.
That might not have access to this testing. But then as you go through puberty, you suddenly are.
All of this, I would add, is just a means of controlling nature, as something that is controlled through profit, productivity, the state, in heteronormative settler colonial Cartesian ways. He's not pushing back against any of this. I would suggest that apart from learning all of these different so-called disorders that people have medically, he should learn a little bit more about the history of medicine and how it affects gender nonconforming people. Because he's a part of that, and he's, complicit right now before our very eyes.
Are sensitive to the testosterone that's being produced. And so now you start to develop more male characteristics, you get more muscle mass, and you do have a true male competitive advantage in
male competitive advantage. So I would argue that, again, so what? It's about competition, and they talk about fairness as something to police in ways that uphold patriarchal modes of thought and racist modes of thought. So it's not about equality. It's a false flag. It's bullshit. They don't care about fairness. They care about the status quo, which is anything but fair in or out of the world of sports.
Sport, despite having been raised your younger childhood as a female. So, yes, that to me is an athlete who should not be permitted to compete because they.
Fuck you, gatekeeper. this is him being a cop. And he's telling himself that it's all about fairness, and no, it's about being unfair. What's more unfair? What you're talking about, insofar as, oh no, someone might be just a little bit faster on the field, which again is tied to profit, or the state exercising an abuse of power to say whether or not someone has the right to exist, to perform on the field or out. That's how genocide works. It's going to affect people everywhere. What's more unfair? Genocide, or someone running a little bit faster on the field and costing some rich asshole a bunch of money?
Have a male advantage, but that person has been raised female their entire life. And so now to just say after the result of a saliva test, sorry, you're actually a man.
So again, it's transmedicalist because it ties to a lived experience. Oh, you've been raised female your whole life, but now because of this one test. And again, it's missing. There's no social understanding of how gender works from this guy at all. It's just pure transmedicalism.
That is just like mind-blowing to that individual. And what's being lost in this whole discussion is a little bit of empathy for the individuals that have these conditions.
For the individuals that have these conditions. So if you have a medical condition, we should pity you. It's infantilizing. But if you don't have these conditions, let's see what they say about that.
I'm not talking about empathy for the individuals who are truly male,
I'm not talking about empathy for the individuals who are truly male. So someone like me, for instance, who doesn't have one of these conditions, I apparently don't deserve empathy. This is what pissed me off. Fuck you, Doc. You're a piece of shit. That's my opinion. As someone who knows a lot more about trans people than you do, we're not just a disease. We're not a sickness, and we don't deserve what's happening to us thanks to fuckfaces like you.
Female, and just decide they want to switch genders with no underlying genetic.
I didn't just decide. Again, what happens at birth, we all start female. There's something that happens that changes our body, but it's not homogenous, and it can affect the brain in ways that are difficult to measure. You can't observe the brain and what's happening inside it. Not easily. I mean, I imagine there are different ways that you could conduct tests to see what people's thoughts and feelings are and things like that, but dysphoria isn't just something that we do arbitrarily because we're trying to sneak into the world of sports and have some unfair advantage. Again, it's the woman in a dress thing. You're a TERF. There is an underlying medical component. It starts in the mind. It's something that doesn't fully change over. And it's called being trans. Congratulations. It's called being, non-binary. These are things, it's not, the social and the biological do overlap to some extent. And matter shapes consciousness. Consciousness maintains matter. Marx. And there is a biological element, but at the end of the day, the social component, gender dysphoria, and the thoughts and feelings that we have, there is a biological component. And you're saying, actually, there isn't anything. And you're ignoring the science there yourself.
Reason for that. I'm talking about the true genetically different situations and hormonally different situations.
So empathy is something to assign whether or not you have certain genetic material. Again, it's eugenicist. Newsflash, Dr. Brian Sutterer, MD, is into race science, is into a form of science that omits empathy from people if they, according to him, don't meet a genetic requirement. And he's doing all of this in the middle of a genocide, by the way. He is a genocide apologist. He is a genocidal actor, in my opinion.
I posted this photo on my X page so you can go on and dive through it because I think it does a really good job of covering these things. This was made with the assistance of Claude with an AI tool to kind of summarize everything. And
ew, gross. Don't use AI. What are you doing? Nasty.
As you can see, a lot of these you're not going to have a real advantage, right? Some of them are going to be raised male even though they don't have a Y chromosome.
And even with the advantages that people would have if they had more testosterone and a different amount of bone density and stuff like that, so what? Whatever happened to, aren't people in for a challenge? They talk about equality, and then you find out about certain athletes that do have some kind of advantage, white straight men, first and foremost. We don't see them getting banned because, again, it's a double standard.
SRY translocation. So understand looking at this that there are variations in these things. And I just wish that these conversations with gender and sports took into account a little bit more empathy for the individuals that truly have these various conditions.
You're a Nazi. That's my opinion of you. I wish you had empathy for trans people more broadly. God, you suck. You act like you know everything because you're able to take the human body apart, and you can't see the forest for the trees when a genocide is happening right in front of you. Open your eyes.
Genetic testing has been done before. In fact, for the Atlanta Olympics, they did SRY testing, I believe, and found, I think, 8 females that had the SRY, were positive for it. They did some subsequent testing, said that I think that they were false positives, allowed them to compete, but they then stopped doing these SRY testings. Other individual athletic organizations have started to do some testing of their own, but this is not like a widespread thing across all the various sports leagues. I think we have to be prepared for, albeit rare, but the possibility that even just 1 or 2 female athletes in big sports like potentially WNBA, soccer, test positive for one of these, and even if they go on to discover that it's one of the conditions that doesn't have a sports advantage.
So again, let's think of the women. But what about trans people? Women are treated as victims in this situation, cis women in particular, but not trans people. We're seen as a threat, and the test is legitimate as far as it's enacted on us, but not those poor women. So where's your empathy for us, Mr. Bleeding Heart?
That is still going to absolutely rock the foundation of that sport, because people will just see, oh, SRY, that must be a man. And they won't be able to think through the downstream implications of if that actually matters.
Yeah, it's the same idea with women, trans women being in women's bathrooms, where suddenly you have cis women who are being impacted. The moment you create a scapegoat like this, it breeds a certain degree of mistrust. And that mistrust leads people to acting out in ways that you have women who look athletic, they look Amazonian. Point in fact, concerning a recent example of an Amazon being policed, refer to Essence of Thought's female model kicked out of bathroom for looking trans, 2026. Persecution of such beings isn't strictly new, but does take on modernized forms of state predation through retro-future police violence. As I respond to Ethel's video, speaking as a gothicist, TERF antics and retrograde fall in line with witch hunts and zombie narratives, i.e. the persecutory and cannibalistic outcomes of worker betrayal occur under neoliberal hegemony and austerity measures, specifically revolutionary countermeasures that historically spiral towards fascism, ergo zombies and witch hunts. Austerity is the trademark feature of fascism, one for which scapegoats and persecution mania aren't just endemic but central. To that, scapegoats once historically applied through some degree of natural scarcity. Capital by comparison preys on workers through manufactured scarcity, furthering abjection. There's not enough, and it's that alien's fault. As capital decays, it tells workers who betray their own, women or otherwise, to find the scapegoat, e.g. the witch, the vampire, the alien, to expose and exterminate. It's essentially a perverse kind of game, specifically a witch hunt, but also death lottery handing out tickets. Someone has to die, seemingly at random, but in reality for the elite. How starving sailors draw straws while stuck in the doldrums. First, they're merely blamed for state crimes and daily operations. When that fails to rectify the shortage, though, traitors, cops separate the targets from the others, the victims chosen seemingly from the margins and away from the in-group. The more decay sets in, however, the more desperate workers come to find the enemy responsible. Unable to, they start to panic, and guided by prescribed moral certainties, their actions grow increasingly conducive to superiority and judgment over others, often through the language of sin, crime, and punishment, but also medical doctrine. To it, someone must always fail or be false by design. It's a death cult, a cruel game where those saved for last eventually eat others like them alive. And it generally doesn't wait until some logical endpoint. Perceived shortages and paranoia cause witch hunts to increase to the monde, seeing barbarians at the gate while cleaning house, seeking the enemy within, the foreign plot, the backstabber to avenge. All to blame anyone but those rigging the game, those quick to betray begin to blame themselves, or those they treat as themselves. Decay sets in. They become alien, both givers and receivers of state force, ergo death warrants. Guided by dogma and moral panic, and kettled by the walls slowly closing in, promising expulsion, they turn blindly inwards, towards the core, when outsiders in war abroad are exhausted. They start to eat themselves. At first, they nibble, striving for clemency, so-called hesitation wounds during the Hunger Games. It's not long before they start to take larger and larger bites, becoming the proverbial next in line, the fatal and false bloodline of the Gothic yarn, one routinely promised by perfidious con men promoting peace and plenty forever stalled by bumps in the road. Unquote. Source YouTube community post, Persephone Vanderwaard, February 4th, 2026. The same issue extends to any workers conscripted under duress, which capital essentially is, not just versus Amazons, but vampire and conqueror, something projected retro-future, often onto whomever the state needs labor to betray. So I think you get the point. The idea being is that he's like, we have to be careful because this will affect women. Yes, it will. Women in sports, women in bathrooms, women everywhere, cis or otherwise, starting with trans women and then bleeding over into cis women who are policed and controlled by the state all the time.
For the sport, they'll just focus on you're a man and like say that person's a man, even if truly maybe they could have and should have been raised as a female. I'm not saying this is
could have, should have. Who are you to decide? Who is the state to decide any of this? Or in Metallica's words, who are you to say I'll take your life from you? Ride the lightning, right? This is a form of state power abuse, and it's something that individuals such as yourself can't see the forest for the trees regarding. You're like, well, okay, there are some trans women who are just false and just decided arbitrarily, apropos of nothing, but when I'm prescribing eugenics, it's totally okay as long as we limit it to the people who are deserving of it.
This is going to be like dozens of athletes, but if you implement this testing on a wide scale like they are, I would be shocked if there...
It shouldn't even be one athlete, is the point. Homeless, right? The homeless child locked in the basement. One person has to suffer for everyone else to enjoy peace and prosperity. It shouldn't be one. There should be zero scapegoats, trans or otherwise.
Are not individuals that test positive. And I just want to take a minute with this whole story because people are championing it like, oh, thank goodness we're finally going to have like safer sports, etc.
Safer sports because trans people are a threat. We're vampires. No, it's like, that's bullshit. And you should be able to just call that out as bullshit right off the bat. Do you have to be a medical doctor to recognize genocide? I don't think so. I'm not a medical doctor. I have a PhD, independent studies, mind you. I have a master's legit and a PhD built off of that through years of study and activism and research. I've done plenty of research. Qualitative, working among different trans people, sex workers or otherwise, fighting against people such as yourself who punched down against us during genocide. You don't have to have a medical degree to recognize that genocide is wrong. This is a moral consideration tied to capital as inherently predatory. And this has been an issue for a long time. Since capital has existed, people have been pointing this out. And yet you're the one with blind eyes.
But think about those athletes who just given them the benefit.
Again, think about the athletes who aren't deserving of this capital punishment, essentially, of being locked up, of being excluded, of being denied any kind of basic human right, playing sports or otherwise. So you're still, as a transmedicalist, arguing for eugenics, arguing for phrenology, just not for real women. So you're a TERF, you're a Nazi, you're a fascist in the land of the free, the home of the brave. You suck.
Benefit of the doubt, who have had like challenging upbringings because of this confusion with their...
And trans people more broadly don't have challenging upbringings because of people such as yourself.
Sexual and gender identity. Because of, again, I'm talking about these real things. I'm not...
Oh, you're talking about these real things and not me. Apparently I'm not real, everybody. I'm a unicorn. Fuck you.
Not talking about the people who just decide one day that they want to be a woman or want to...
Oh my God. Transphobic. Intermisic. No, we don't just decide anything. This was a decision that was based on an entire life that I lived. When I came out as trans, I was trans before I came out. I was trans the moment I was born. Don't you get it? Apparently not. So again, you're transphobic. And you're hiding that behind some veneer of reason, which genocidal people do.
Be a man. I'm talking about these real, identifiable, diagnosed...
Can't you identify me based on what's happening to us? Hath the Jew not ears, eyes? If you prick us, do we not bleed? Like really, you are the lawyers at Shylock's court. And, and I'm asking, apparently me asking to be recognized is seen as my pound of flesh, as opposed to my revenge is literally just being recognized as human. And you're saying, well, we're not real. So this is you obfuscating genocide, ignoring what's happening to us. What's your opinion about that? I was serious. Do you have an opinion about transgenocide?
Possible genetic and hormonal problems that
it's not just defined by those. There's a tremendous social component through which the state, using a diagnosing tactic, enacts genocide, which you're a part of. You're not acknowledging anything that the state is doing in a way that prevents harm. You are causing harm, doctor.
We know scientifically exist. That's what I'm talking about here.
Trans people are acknowledged scientifically. Sociology is a science. Gender studies is a science. It's not just the medical profession. Like, you have this weird STEM bias and you think that science doesn't exist outside of the STEM fields. Sociology is a science. Gender studies is a science.
I just don't feel like the story so far has addressed that true, like, mental well-being and societal effect on those athletes if
those deserving straight athletes
they test positive. Even just the simple idea of an athlete refusing to participate in the Olympics will raise speculation that is going to have probably negative effects on their health and well-being. That doesn't...
on theirs. But, fuck the rest of us, right? I'm not gonna... I almost don't feel like watching the rest of this because he's already shown his ass plenty of times. He's, in my opinion, a giant piece of shit. You can quote me on that, doctor. Pull your head out of your ass. Stop being transmedicalist. Stop being fascist. Because what are you going to say in the rest of this video that, unless you just completely contradict yourself, whatever, I don't care. You're already saying that we're not real, and then you're arguing that they just retool the policy to protect real women from false imposters who just decided one day to be trans, and apparently there's no medical reason for it. And you're the one contradicting yourself by ignoring the biology and the science and the social aspects to trans people in the middle of a genocide. You suck. You lose. Good day, sir. I'm done. This concludes the video. Thank you for watching. I hope you found it informative and educational. And remember that doctors have skeletons in the closet, or in the case of this guy, hanging out in front of you. And if you pay attention and you know a little bit about trans people beyond the narrow scope of knowledge that this person has, you'll see the arguments he is making are not only like deeply spurious, but perfidious, treacherous. Even if he thinks that he is doing a great amount of good, even though whenever he talks about trans people in this video, trans people who, according to him, are false, you can hear the disdain in his voice, and that were threats to the institution that he swore to defend. He doesn't care about the Hippocratic Oath for all people, just for some. He's a gatekeeper. And I hope that I made that clear in this video. If you agree with me, if you care about preventing genocide, feel free to leave a comment, like, share, and subscribe. If you disagree with me, well, that's never stopped anyone from saying something, so if you do, well, just keep in mind if you say something, pro-genocide, I'm just going to block the comment. Like, it's not going to get through. But if you have something positive to say, by all means. And doctor, if you are actually interested in learning about a world outside of the very narrow one in which you live, if you want to go outside of your bubble, as Morpheus said to Neo, I'm trying to free your mind. So kindly pull your head out of your ass. Until next time, thank you for watching, and stay safe out there.